Next, I want to talk about the concept of supranationalism and devolution. And so the general idea here is that there are forces that bind people together and forces that cause people to want to split apart from one another. And we can call these centripetal forces that kind of bring people together. And it's centripetal forces that where people need one another, like where countries need one another because they're small and have small economies, so they need to work together. This promotes what's called supranationalism, where three or more countries work together to maybe share a currency, to trade with each other, protect each other with military alliances, and so on. Europe is also experiencing, in some cases, centrifugal forces, like a centrifuge which spins around. If you've ever gone to a fair and been on the gravitron, that's a centrifugal force, pulls you apart, right? And so these forces really kind of split countries apart, or even regions apart, like the European Union. And so centrifugal forces promote devolution, like the breaking up of people. And these are two forces that are at work in different ways in Europe, but there are some very strong needs for supranationalism. And probably this is a figure showing some of the unification. The biggest is the European Union, which is an economic union between many of the countries. This is also showing what's called the Schengen area, where people can move freely from one country to the other without having a passport. So there is a lot of, they're trying to model a little bit after what the United States did, like open up their economies to each other, have freedom of movement like we do between our states. Not exactly, but kind of a little bit. Now, we do have this kind of unique case here where one country actually voted to leave the European Union. We'll come back to that. And the other thing that's shown here is these little money symbols. These are countries that use a common currency called the euro. So let's kind of get into them. Let's kind of take a step back and talk about the European Union, which is really the most important aspect of supranationalism in Europe. This is an economic union of 28 member states or countries. Collectively, there's 500 million people in the European Union. So we talk about how the countries are not very big. You have maybe 83 or 80 something million people in Germany. It's not a huge country, but so it's difficult for Germany, even though Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, Germany would be a small player compared to the United States or China, right? So it's hard for Germany to really have a lot of leverage competing with China or the United States. Now, you put together Germany and France and United Kingdom and a number of other countries, then you can pull together a larger economic union. So that's the idea of the European Union, is that by working together, you can have a much bigger economic impact than each individual by themselves. One beginning of it is something called the Benelux Agreement. Benelux happens to be, I'll kind of show this when we get closer. These countries are Belgium, Netherlands, and little Luxembourg here. There are three small countries, and them in particular really needed to work together at the end of World War II to rebuild their economy by agreements for steel and coal and things like that. That grew into what's called the European Coal and Steel Community, and then eventually it kind of evolved over time. I think this kind of shows a little bit of the timeline of it. Some of the first part in the 1950s, some of the first countries were those kind of in the middle of Europe. Others joined, into the 70s and 80s. You had a whole bunch of countries join in the 2000s. Many of these were parts of the former Soviet Union or nearby countries that had kind of gained their independence from Russia after the end of the Cold War. And we'll get into more of that later. But this is just a little timeline showing probably about one of the first kind of baby steps towards unification was that Benelux Agreement, the agreement between those three little countries. But I do also want to highlight this second one. And the second one is important. It's something called the Marshall Plan. And if you note the timing of it, if you remember world history, this is at the end of World War II. So at the end of World War II, we're going to come back and talk about this. This is the beginning of the Cold War period, where there's a lot of competing of influence between the United States and the Soviet Union in Europe. And the Soviet Union, had control over parts of Europe. The United States was trying to take a different approach, and through loans and rebuilding, trying to develop allies in Europe. So the Marshall Plan was a plan where the United States really financially supported the rebuilding of Western European countries at the end of World War II. Another example of supranationalism is the euro currency. This is a common currency. Not every country uses it, though. There's some in the United Kingdom that never adopted the euro as its currency because it had its own kind of globally used currency at the time. Many Eastern European countries that are new to the European Union their banking systems aren't quite kind of developed enough to switch to the currency, but many of those where, even those ones where it's not their official currency, you can trade using euros. So even if it's not official, you can still pay in euros. But one thing about it is that the Eurozone, which it's called, has a centralized banking system. So like in the United States, we have what we call the Federal Reserve, and they're the ones that print money, right? They're the ones that make sure that they can adjust to if we have a recession or we have whatever kind of financial difficulties that we're having. One thing difficult with the euro, though, is that the centralized bank is for multiple countries. So if one country goes into a recession, then the other ones have to kind of bail them out. That can lead to conflict between the countries because they might have, some may not really want to be using their tax money to bail out their neighboring country. We'll also include some videos that talk about that as well. Okay. Another example of supranationalism is NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is a political and military alliance of 28 countries. Now, the European Union has 28 countries. These are different ones because it goes beyond Europe. In particular, the biggest NATO member is the United States. The United States is part of the big, this is kind of the end of World War II, beginning of Cold War. This is an alliance between the United States and Canada and many of the Western European countries that it's helping to rebuild during the Marshall Plan era. Another one, non-European one, is Turkey here as well. I'll include a video that talks a little bit more about NATO. Now we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about NATO later in the lecture. This is showing a map of some of the NATO countries. One thing maybe I'll highlight here, this is showing NATO membership in Europe. One thing I'll highlight, let me kind of go back a little bit as well. All right. Okay, when it comes to European Union membership, this is Switzerland. Switzerland is not a member of the European Union. Switzerland also is not a part of the Eurozone. It doesn't use the euro. This is Switzerland too. It's not part of NATO. So when it comes to, the supranationalism, not every country is part of this. That some countries like Switzerland are more resistant to the supranationalism and tend to kind of mind their own business. Or they're not part of NATO, not part of the European Union, and so on. So not every country is involved with every one of these types of alliances. By the way, just more trivia. Why is this little country in South America highlighted? Give you a second. So that's French Guiana, because it's officially part of France. It gets highlighted on the map here as well. So. Okay. All right. Oh yeah. So now one thing I want to highlight, and I'll come back and talk about this again, um, is the Balkans up here. The Balkan states by the Baltic Sea. Not Balkan. The Baltic states. Sorry. By the Baltic Sea. There's also an area called the Balkans. We'll talk about it later. This is the Baltic area. This kind of sounds similar. You have NATO countries. These are countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union and have since joined NATO. And then you also have countries that are aligned with Russia, including Belarus. There's a big, a lot of demonstrations going on now in Belarus. And then you also have part of Russia that is what's called an exclave over here. So we'll kind of talk about this, these countries a little bit later. I wanted to highlight that. Now, let's jump ahead and talk about devolution. Devolution is where countries or regions have a tendency to break from one another. Now, we'll look at some examples around Europe, but I want to introduce a couple of other terms that are related to this. One is the concept of being a shatter belt, that places like, this is, at one time, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, these were at one time a big country called Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was held together by a dictator, and when the dictator fell, this region broke into a number of smaller countries. So parts of Eastern Europe are considered a shatter belt region where, unless you have some like very strong government holding a country together, they tend to break into smaller parts. And this part is called the Balkans, and so there is another term called balkanization. That balkanization is the idea that it goes along with the shatter belt, that it countries will subdivide into smaller ones if they're not controlled by a larger entity. All right, now this is a figure showing where there are devolutionary pressures on different countries in Europe. Yeah, and I'll highlight a couple here. I'll highlight the United Kingdom, which does not include Ireland, but does include Northern Ireland. So Ireland is an independent country, but this part of Ireland, Northern Ireland, part of the island, actually belongs to the United Kingdom. Yeah? And one thing we might highlight is that there are some cultural and linguistic differences in Scotland, Ireland, and this part of the kingdom called Wales. Right? So the United Kingdom is united four kingdoms. This is England here, the dominant one. Smaller one called Wales, another one called Scotland, and one called Northern Ireland. And while England is the dominant country, there is pressure for Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland to break away and become independent. For example, Scotland voted to, very narrowly was defeated, but almost voted to leave the United Kingdom and become an independent country. There is some pressure for Northern Ireland to be reunited with the rest of Ireland and become independent from the United Kingdom. Also in Spain, we have a few regions, Galicia, the people here kind of have different cultural background. The Basque people have a cultural background. At one time, they fought a bitter campaign to gain independence from Spain. And then we have Catalonia, where people people speak a little bit of a different language. But Catalonia actually had a vote to leave Spain. Now Spain declared it illegal and cracked down on it, but these are examples of where there are devolutionary forces. Spain and the United Kingdom provide a couple of good examples. If we look at a language map, we can see that there are even linguistic differences as well in Galicia, Basque region, and Catalonia. Now this is kind of talking about Europe, or Eastern Europe, as a shatter belt. So prior to the First World War, you had some large empires, like the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After losing the war, some of these were broken up into smaller bits. So the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was broken into places like Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and so on. Now, Czechoslovakia is currently broken up now too into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Let's illustrate that a little bit. So You have the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which had been part of Czechoslovakia, which had been part of, you know, the Austrian Empire at one time. So this is showing, you know, this eastern part of Europe as a shadow belt, this balkanization from large empires to smaller and smaller and smaller entities. This is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia broke up into Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and so forth. And then lastly, we have devolutionary forces for the European Union itself. And I think you probably got this in the homework, but the Brexit. And Brexit is where Brexit, let's just kind of do it here. Brexit is where the United Kingdom actually voted. They didn't expect it to win, but they narrowly voted. This is in 2015, where no one thought that they would actually vote to do it, but part of the government we're tired of people complaining about the European Union, so they try to call their bluff and say, well, tell you what, we'll have a vote whether you want to stay or leave the European Union, assuming people would want to do it. But the campaign got weird, other outside forces got involved, things that we may be familiar with, and it narrowly passed. They voted to leave the European Union, and now they're in a real mess trying to actually make that work. I'll post some videos on it. But Brexit is a good example of devolutionary for the region too, because it is United Kingdom wanting to leave the European Union. And the reason why I have this figure too is that that's going to even strain the United Kingdom's devolutionary forces, because now Scotland, which wants to be part of the European Union, may vote to leave United Kingdom so that they could rejoin the European Union. Northern Ireland may want to rejoin with Ireland. Wales maybe even at some point, maybe less likely than Scotland, but that kind of, these are examples of these devolutionary forces at work.